Hey friends, welcome back to Unpolished but Called. And today's episode is for the ones who showed up and still feel like they're losing. The ones who did the thing, prayed, tried, stayed, obeyed, and are quietly wondering why nothing seems to have changed yet. If that's you, pull up a chair. This is a gentle one because today we're talking about a truth we forgot far too easily. Showing up is not failure. But you know what nobody really prepares you for? The kind of tired that comes from doing the right thing for a long time without anything obvious happening. Not the dramatic, life is on fire tired, just that low grade, always there fatigue that shows up when you've been faithful longer than you've been inspired. It's the tired that creeps in when you're still praying, still trusting, still trying to live this out. The days all start to blur together. Nothing is crashing down, but nothing is really lifting up either. You're not quitting, you're just quietly wondering if this is what faith is supposed to feel like. Most of us don't say that part out loud. We don't want to sound ungrateful or doubtful or weak, so we just keep it tucked away, nod along, keep showing up, and hope eventually something clicks and starts to feel different. And when it doesn't, we start questioning ourselves. Maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe we misunderstood God. Maybe everyone else has moved ahead and we're the only ones still standing in the same place. But here's the thing we need to say plainly, without dressing it up. Showing up is not failure. It just doesn't always feel like success. Somewhere along the way, we absorb this idea that faith is supposed to feel rewarding, that obedience should come with a sense of momentum, that if God is pleased, there should be some kind of internal reassurance or external confirmation, a feeling, a sign, a noticeable shift. So when faith starts to feel quiet and repetitive, we assume we're losing ground. When the excitement fades, we assume something is wrong. When obedience feels more like routine than revelation, we label it spiritual stagnation. But that's not actually how faith works. Real faith settles in and gets familiar, stops announcing itself. And that's usually when we get uncomfortable because familiarity feels suspicious to us. We're used to associating growth with intensity, big moments, emotions, changes. Steady obedience doesn't photograph well. And yet, that's where most transformation actually happens. Think about it. The deepest changes in our lives rarely come from one dramatic moment. They come from repetition, from habits formed slowly, decisions made over and over again when no one is watching and nothing exciting is happening. And faith works the same way. The problem isn't that we're still here. The problem is that we expected still here to feel more impressive. We don't struggle because faith is hard. We struggle because faith is often ordinary. Ordinary mornings, ordinary prayers, ordinary choices to respond a little differently than we used to. And that doesn't feel like progress. It feels like maintenance. And maintenance doesn't get celebrated. So when faith feels like maintenance instead of movement, we start to doubt ourselves. We start measuring our spiritual life the same way we measure productivity. Are we growing? Are we advancing? Are we getting somewhere? But faith isn't a ladder, and it's definitely not a scoreboard. A lot of the exhaustion we carry isn't from obedience itself. It's from trying to turn obedience into proof. Proof that God is working. Proof that we're doing it right. Proof that this season means something. When we don't get that proof, we assume the effort must be wasted. It isn't. There's a version of faith we rarely talk about because it doesn't make for great stories. The version where nothing big happens, but nothing falls apart either. We're just present, still trusting God, even though you don't feel particularly brave or spiritual about it. And that version of faith matters. Actually, it might matter more than the dramatic moments we love to share. Scripture is full of people who lived in that space for years. Long stretches of waiting, obedience without immediate payoff, trust without clarity, and we remember them for the big moments. But they were formed in the quiet ones. They didn't know how their stories would turn out while they were living them. And neither do we. We want faith to come with instructions and timelines. We want to know how long we'll have to keep showing up before something changes. And God doesn't usually answer those questions. Instead, He invites us to stay. And staying is harder than leaving in ways we don't talk about enough. Leaving feels decisive. Staying feels unresolved. Staying means waking up again and choosing trust without guarantees. It means resisting the urge to do something drastic just so we can feel movement. It means letting God work on His timeline instead of forcing change just to relieve our discomfort. And that's not weakness. That's restraint. And restraint takes strength. And a lot of us are stronger than we think, simply because we're still here, still praying, even when prayer feels repetitive, still choosing obedience, even when motivation has faded, still trusting God's character, even when His plans feel confusing. And that's not stagnation. That's faith with roots. So remember, roots grow underground. You don't see them forming. You don't feel them spreading. But they're the reason the tree stands when the weather turns. If faith feels hidden right now, it doesn't mean it's not growing. It usually means it is. And we've bought into the idea that spiritual growth should feel like upward motion. But sometimes growth feels like learning how to stay balanced when nothing is pushing you forward. Sometimes growth looks like resisting the urge to label a quiet season as a wasted one. God isn't rushing you. He's not tapping His watch, waiting for you to figure something out faster. He's not disappointed that your faith looks less dramatic than it used to. He's not measuring you by intensity or output or spiritual charisma. He's with you in the ordinary days, the in-between moments, the slow stretches where trust doesn't feel heroic, just necessary. If all you've managed lately is consistency, that's not something to apologize for. Consistency is faith when emotion steps out of the way. And honestly, that's when faith becomes real. Not when it feels powerful, when it feels obvious, But when it feels like a choice you keep making quietly because you trust God more than you trust your feelings, that's not failure. That's maturity. And maturity doesn't come with applause. So if we're honest, the hardest part of all of this isn't the showing up itself. It's the not knowing what is leading to. We can handle effort. We can even handle sacrifice. What messes with us is effort without clarity, sacrifice without a visible return, staying without any real sense of direction. That's where our minds start spinning. Because when nothing changes on the outside, we assume the problem must be on the inside. We start replaying our choices, our prayers, our motives. We wonder if we're missing something obvious. Or worse, if God expects something from us that we just haven't figured out yet. And slowly, without meaning to, faith turns into pressure. Not because God put it there, but because we did. So somewhere along the way, we decided that outcomes were our responsibility. That if things weren't shifting, it must mean we weren't believing hard enough, praying correctly, obeying fully, trusting properly. We turned faith into a performance review instead of a relationship. That's exhausting. And God never asked us to manage results. He never handed us the burden of timing, visibility, or payoff. He simply asked us to trust Him, to walk with Him, to stay oriented toward Him, even when the road felt longer than we expected. We're the ones who keep grabbing for proof. And it makes sense. Proof feels grounding. Proof quiets anxiety. Proof gives us something solid to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. But faith doesn't grow through proof. It grows through trust. And trust, real trust, is built in moments where we don't have control. That's the part we don't like. Because control feels active. Trust feels passive. Control makes us feel involved. Trust asks us to wait. And waiting feels like doing nothing, even when it's not. A lot of what we label as spiritual passivity is actually restraint. It's choosing not to force outcomes, not to manipulate circumstances, not to make impulsive changes just so anything, feels different. Restraint doesn't get celebrated, but it matters. Think about how often we're tempted to create movement just to relieve discomfort. We change direction, not because God led us there, but because standing still feels unbearable. We label restlessness as conviction. We label impatience as discernment. We label escape as obedience. And then we wonder why things feel unstable. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is stay put long enough for God to do the deeper work we can't rush. That kind of faith doesn't feel productive. It feels slow. It feels inefficient. It feels like everyone else is moving while we're stuck in neutral. But neutral doesn't mean inactive. A lot is happening beneath the surface when nothing seems to be happening at all. God does some of His most important work where we can't see it. In motives and postures, in the quiet recalibration of our expectations, in teaching us the difference between trusting Him and trying to manage Him. And that lesson takes time. We want faith to feel like momentum. And God often teaches faith through endurance. We want reassurance. God builds trust through consistency. We want clarity. God often gives enough light for the next step and no more. Boy, that's frustrating. But it's intentional. Because if God gave us full clarity, we wouldn't need trust. If He handed us outcomes up front, faith would just be a strategy. And God is not interested in being used as a means to an end. He wants relationship. And relationships are not transactional. You don't measure the health of a relationship by how quickly it produces results. You measure it by presence, by honesty, by whether you keep showing up even when the other person doesn't immediately fix things or meet your expectations. Faith works the same way. There are seasons where God feels quiet, not because He's distant, but because He's inviting us into a deeper kind of trust. The kind that isn't fueled by constant reassurance. The kind that doesn't depend on emotional reinforcement. That's when faith starts to grow up. And growing up doesn't feel glamorous. It feels like learning how to sit with unanswered questions without letting them harden into resentment. It feels like choosing obedience, even when obedience doesn't come with a dopamine hit. It feels like trusting God's heart when His plans don't make sense to us yet. And that's not small faith. That's resilient faith. We don't talk enough about how strong you have to be to keep believing without immediate evidence. How much courage it takes to stay soft when life feels stalled. How much trust it requires to keep praying when the answers don't come quickly or clearly. If you're still here, still trusting God, still choosing to stay connected when, even though it feels quiet and unresolved, that says more about your faith than any dramatic testimony ever could. You're not failing because things feel slow. You're learning how to trust without needing constant feedback. And that's hard. But it's also freeing once you stop fighting it. Because when you release the need for outcomes, something loosens inside you. You stop performing, negotiating, trying to figure out how to unlock the next phase. Like a faith is a puzzle you haven't solved yet. You start showing up because you trust God, not because you're waiting for Him to prove something. And that changes everything. Faith becomes lighter. Not easier, but lighter. You're no longer carrying responsibility that doesn't belong to you. You're no longer measuring your worth by what you can point to. You're no longer panicking every time life feels still. You're walking with God instead of dragging Him behind your expectations. And wait, here's the part that's easy to miss while you're in it. Faithfulness doesn't always change your circumstances right away, but it always changes you. It deepens you, steadies you, anchors you. Those changes don't announce themselves. You usually notice them later when you respond differently than you used to. And something that would have rattled you before doesn't anymore. When you realize you're trusting God in ways you couldn't have handled a year ago. Friend, that growth didn't come from breakthroughs. It came from showing up, staying, waiting, trusting without guarantees. So if you're sitting there wondering whether your faith counts because it doesn't look impressive, let me say this plainly. God is not unimpressed with you. He sees the quiet obedience, the unseen trust. The days you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. And he values those things far more than visible success. Showing up is not the thing you do while you wait for real faith to begin. Showing up is real faith. So before we finish, I'll just say this. If you ever want to connect more or explore the resources we've been creating, you can find everything on KathrinShaffer.com. And you can always reach me on Facebook under the exact same name. On the website, you can find books, studies, and study materials. Sometimes people ask how to support the work. There's no pressure. The podcast will always be free. But remember, wherever you are right now, keep showing up, even when it feels ordinary. Especially then. Until next time, friends.